By February 7th, 1941, British forces had reached El Agheila and taken around 130,000 Italian prisoners. It looked, at least for a moment, like a campaign that might keep rolling west. A month later, Churchill was telling Roosevelt that Britain was sending the greater part of the Army of the Nile to Greece and reinforcing it with as much air power as possible. That is the contradiction at the heart of this story. A successful offensive in the desert was interrupted not because victory there had been secured, but because another crisis in another theater could not be ignored. The British success in North Africa before the Greek expedition was real. It was not a later legend invented to make the Greek decision look foolish. Under Wavell, the Western Desert Offensive had broken the Italian position with startling speed. By February 7, 1941, the advance had reached El Agheila, and the campaign had yielded about 130,000 Italian prisoners. That matters because it created a genuine sense of momentum. In London and Cairo alike, there was now something to interrupt. But momentum is not the same thing as a finished war. The British had struck a badly handled Italian army and driven it back across Cyrenaica. They had not solved the larger problems of distance, supply, and scarcity that governed every campaign in the desert. The farther west a force moved from Egypt, the longer its line of communication became, and the more vulnerable every success was to fresh enemy reinforcement. What looked like a decisive opening could still turn into a pause. Even so, Wavell had reasons to think the Italians in Africa could be pressed harder. The Desert Campaign had reached El Agheila before the Greek commitment took final shape. So when troops, aircraft, shipping, and staff attention were drawn toward the Aegean in February and March, the cost was not imaginary. Britain was diverting experienced forces away from the one theater where they had recently been winning. This is where later arguments often become too tidy. One version says Churchill abandoned victory. Another says North Africa could not yet have been won in any durable sense, so the diversion changed little. The evidence points somewhere less dramatic and more uncomfortable. Britain had created an opportunity in Libya, but not a secure end state. That made the Greek decision neither absurd nor harmless. It meant choosing to break the tempo of one campaign before its gains had been consolidated. The choice for Greece did not emerge from a blank page. British leaders were dealing with a live political commitment, a deteriorating Balkan situation, and the fear that refusing aid would echo far beyond Athens. Greece had already been fighting Italy. If Germany intervened and Britain stood aside, the consequences would not be measured only in divisions and air squadrons. They would also be measured in what British promises were worth. Churchill leaned toward action. The documentary record is plain that this was done with open eyes. On March 10, 1941, he wrote to Roosevelt that Britain was sending the greater part of the Army of the Nile to Greece and strengthening the air forces to the utmost. That is not the language of a token gesture. It was a serious commitment taken from a theater that still demanded men and aircraft. The same record also shows unease. American diplomatic reporting preserved in Foreign Relations of the United States described the decision as one reached after painful discussion in Cairo, and with full awareness of the risks. That is an important corrective to the habit of treating the Greek expedition as either noble inevitability or reckless fantasy. Those involved knew they were gambling. Wavell's position was different, and it deserves to be stated carefully. He was not simply a prophet, later proved right by events. He was the commander responsible for a running campaign in North Africa, and he judged that the better use of force lay there. FRUS material reports that after returning to Cairo, he signaled that he was not wanted in Greece and would rather finish off the Italians in Africa. That was an operational warning from the man closest to the immediate military problem. London did not ignore him because his argument was weak. London overruled him because the government was balancing a different set of dangers. If Britain refused Greece, it would preserve concentration in the desert. It might also signal to friend and foe alike that British support was conditional precisely when German pressure was rising in southeastern Europe. No cabinet paper could make that trade-off clean. It was a case of choosing which risk to accept first. The Greek campaign failed quickly. In April 1941, the British-Greek defense collapsed and the expedition ended in evacuation. Whatever had been hoped for in political or military terms, this much is beyond dispute. Britain had committed forces to mainland Greece and then had to pull them out under pressure. The defeat exposed the simplest fact in the whole episode. Britain did not possess enough readily available strength in the eastern Mediterranean to conduct a major desert campaign, support Greece against German intervention, and absorb reverses in both places at once. At almost the same time, the North African balance shifted. Rommel's intervention made the Desert War harder and longer for Britain. German reinforcement prevented the earlier success against Italy from turning into an uncomplicated march to a final settlement in Libya. Once that happened, every earlier decision acquired a harsher light. Forces that had left Egypt for Greece were no longer being measured against beaten Italian formations, but against a new and more dangerous opponent. This is the point at which blame is often overstated. The diversion to Greece did weaken Britain's immediate position in North Africa. It removed part of the force that had been exploiting success and interrupted continuity at a vulnerable moment. Yet the later reverses in the desert cannot be assigned to Greece alone. Rommel's arrival mattered. British overextension mattered. So did the wider strain of operating across the Mediterranean with limited shipping, limited reserves, and competing emergencies. Still, one conclusion is hard to escape. The Greek expedition did not merely fail on its own terms, it also narrowed Britain's margin for error elsewhere. A government can survive one disappointed plan more easily than two simultaneous ones. In the spring of 1941, Britain discovered what happened when it tried to carry both. So was Churchill wrong? In the narrow military sense, the argument against the Greek expedition is powerful. Britain interrupted a successful offensive, divided scarce strength, and entered a campaign that ended in defeat. Wavell's instinct to press what was working in North Africa was grounded in the realities of force, distance, and timing. But strategy in 1941 was not a staff exercise conducted with one front isolated from the rest. Churchill was not deciding whether to move counters on a clean map. He was deciding whether Britain, still fighting largely alone in Europe, could afford to refuse a country already under Axis pressure and still expect its declarations, guarantees, and alignments to carry weight. That political question cannot be dismissed as decoration around the real war. It was part of the war. The difficulty is that the military and political answers point in different directions. If the standard is concentration of force, Greece looks like a costly diversion. If the standard includes alliance credibility and the attempt to resist further Axis expansion in the Balkans, the decision becomes easier to understand even though the outcome was poor. My own judgment, based on the evidence we do have, is that Britain chose a politically intelligible course at a moment when it lacked the means to make that course succeed. The empire could still strike hard, as the advance to Elagala had shown. It could not guarantee results in Libya and Greece simultaneously once Germany decided to contest both theaters. That is why this episode endures. It was not simply a story of Churchill spoiling victory in the desert, and not simply a story of honorable loyalty to an ally. It was a demonstration of wartime limits. In early 1941, Britain could still choose where to take risk. It could not choose a world in which every commitment could be met with equal force. In the end, the question is not whether Britain paid for Greece. It did. The harder question is whether refusing Greece would have spared Britain enough to secure North Africa quickly and cleanly. The record does not allow that certainty. What it does show is a government trying to act as a reliable ally while fighting with inadequate means across too wide a map. Churchill's gamble in Greece did not alone lose the desert, but it did help turn a promising victory into a longer and harsher war.